Now we're going to take a look at personal style theory and depression. There's an argument that there are two main orientations or traits that, in the extreme, can give us a vulnerability to distress. Sociotropy or dependency is a trait-like degree of investment that people have in social relationships. Someone at the extreme end of sociotropy or dependency derive all of their sense of worth from relationships with other people. Their self-worth and feeling good about who they are is directly related to interpersonal relationships. And in order to function well in the world, they're required continual input that everything is okay. In contrast, there is a second trait-like feature that is autonomy or self-criticism. This implicates independence and achievement. Whereas sociotropy and dependency derive their self-worth through relationships with other people, autonomy and self-criticism look at self-worth via independent achievement. So their self-worth is influenced by their performance in the work domain, academics, sports, or other domains of life. And these are dimensional. Theoretically, we can be really high in either one of these domains and be totally fine. The problem occurs when we are high in one of these and we meet the right environmental stressor. Consistent with what's called the congruency hypothesis, depression results when diathesis interacts with a domain-relevant stressor. For example, if someone who's high in sociotropy and dependency experiences rejection, either real or perceived, then depressive affect is hypothesized to result. Whereas someone high in autonomy who experiences social rejection will likely not be sent into a depressive episode. They may be sad or disappointed, but not likely to develop depression. Why? Because the stressor is not domain congruent. Now, if you imagine that the stressor had to do with achievement, like failing to do well at work or a class, then you can see how it might affect the person. When we're talking about stress, we're talking about the social components that are filtered through individual meaning, but we're also talking about the biological responses that stress induces. We've already looked briefly at the fight or flight response across men and women. The physiological stress response can be broken down into the fast response and the slow response. The fast response is nearly instantaneous. The sympathetic adrenomedullary response is the autonomic response. This is the activation of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal glands release epinephrine and norepinephrine. When we perceive an emergency, our heart rate and blood pressure goes up and there's a dumping of adrenaline in the bloodstream, essentially activating fight or flight. The slower response is related to the HPA axis, or the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis. This is a different area than the adrenal glands. In this case, we're talking about the stress hormone cortisol. This is the hormone in the body that has an anti-inflammatory response and raises blood glucose. Cortisol is released by the HPA axis when we perceive stress. This response takes a little bit longer compared to the fast response, and there is a chemical cascade from the hypothalamus to the pituitary glands to the adrenal, which increases blood glucose and decreases inflammation. Generally, the body resets itself when there is no chronic stress. A signal is sent to the hypothalamus, which in turn signals to the rest of the body to stop the release of cortisol. When we're chronically stressed, however, that regulatory feedback loop is damaged, and we'll have high levels of circulating stress hormones over time. So the short-term benefit of cortisol is negative in the long term. Our immunity starts to break down, our blood pressure rises, and our ability to metabolize fats is compromised. Have you ever had a period in your life where you've been chronically stressed, and then at the end of being stressed out, you get sick? Some researchers argue that this is the product of overactivation of the HPA axis, which has dumped so much cortisol into your body that your immune system is significantly weakened, resulting in you getting sick. So stress has clear negative health outcomes, but stressors on their own, however, don't lead to the stress response. Stressors are filtered through layers of appraisal, but what is appraisal? Appraisal is the meaning we apply to things. Lazarus and Folkman have articulated their transaction model of stress to describe the model that appraisal plays in stressful events. Essentially, stress, they would argue, is a transaction between events and individuals. They believe that there are three important types of appraisal: primary, secondary, and reappraisal. Primary appraisal has to do with assessing its relevance and assessing whether it's benign or threatening. Then, if the event is assessed to be threatening and relevant, Then you do an analysis of your resources, or a secondary appraisal. This involves questions like, how can I handle it? Can I meet this challenge? Do I have the time, the social support, the financial resources? If the answer to that is yes, then stress is lower. If it's no, then you're sure to be really stressed. Then we come back to reappraisal, which is coming back to assessing the threat and resources after we have gathered some feedback. The most important person factor here is appraisal, or the meaning that we have attributed to the event. And there are two general approaches to coping, this model argues: emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping. If we're emotion-focused coping, we are dealing with the emotional consequences of the stress, not the stressors themselves. Sometimes emotion-focused coping is helpful, particularly when there's nothing we can do. This can involve trying to reduce the negative feelings arising from the stressor or the problem. Keeping yourself busy, avoiding thinking about the problem, praying, or venting to a friend. If we are problem-focused coping, we are mitigating the stressor. If the stressor is an exam, you're studying. As you study more and more, the stress changes. If you are in control of the stressor, it's best to use a problem-focused coping strategy. This strategy targets the stress directly. The best way to cope is usually dependent on the situation. So if you're dealing with a loss of someone close to you, emotion-focused coping can help process the loss. But in the example of a heavy course load, talking about how stressful taking 18 credits is may not be helpful. It may be better just to drop the class. An emotion-focused strategy in coping with a final exam is perhaps drinking heavily. It's an ineffective solution in the long run because the problem doesn't go away, but perhaps very adaptive in the short term. Stressors are not synonymous with the stress response. Primary and secondary appraisal are the mediators and moderators of the two, and also control the stress hormone release. So how is personality implicated here? Well, we have dispositional tendencies to see events as more or less threatening to us, and our personality, as we learned in the diathesis stress model, influences what we see and what we attend to. Highly sociotropic people are more sensitive to social clues and perhaps more likely to interpret a benign yet ambiguous circumstance as a form of rejection. We also have dispositional tendencies to view ourselves as more or less able to cope. Some of us are low in self-efficacy. We tend to assess our ability to meet challenges as low. And as we learned from Bandura, if we believe we can't, we don't. And you may resort to emotion-focused coping that helps in the short term, but not in the long term.